All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky. I am your host for this afternoon's exciting program where we continue to explore the amazing evidence for the global Genesis flood. On Standing for Truth, we uphold the truth of biblical creation. And I am thrilled to have Ryan Thompson, a geologist, back with me to assist in accomplishing this valuable mission. Ryan's presentation this afternoon is titled Geology and Revelation Points to the Creator. Now, this is a two-part series, and specifically, this is part two of this series that will examine several interesting topics. These topics and points comprise what would happen if these stresses on the Earth's crust were eased, the descriptions found in prophecy will happen, earthquakes and volcanic eruptions increasing exponentially. Geologic events will increase in their severity and may even culminate in the disappearance of mountains and islands into the sea. And many of the subtle clues in Revelation actually fit with the geology of the Holy Land. This is all explored in this important program. Ryan, I am pumped for this. I feel like we were just here together last month. Time flies by when you're having fun. And so it really is a privilege to have you back, brother. Tell us, how have you been since part one of this series? And for anybody unfamiliar with who you are, feel free to give a bit of an introduction, Ryan. It's great to have you.
Hey, Donnie, thanks. Yeah, it's great to be back. I am doing fantastic. I was in the States recently, and on the way back, I got to spend almost 24 hours in Iceland and see some of the recent lava flows there from only a couple months ago, and got a chunk from it. And as a geologist, that's just super exciting. And so the summer has been off to a good start for me, and but mostly excited to be back here on the show with you. This is awesome. Thanks for having me on again.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It sounds like you've had a good, adventurous month, Ryan. The joys of being a geologist, and you get to take all of that experience, knowledge, and expertise, and experience in the field, directly in the field, and you get to convey that information to us. And so, I do want to give a shout out and promote some of your material here in the live chat. We've got your website, remnantrendezvous.org, YouTube channel, and the book that we'll be discussing. There we go. I love it. Great cover. And so for those in the audience who like what they're hearing from Ryan Thompson here this afternoon, please do consider supporting him, giving him a subscription, and check out his book and material here. Okay, for anybody who might be new to this channel or new to Ryan Thompson, allow me to give a formal introduction before we get into the presentation. Ryan holds a Master of Science degree in geoscience and worked for over a decade in the petroleum industry. After living in the Holy Land with his wife and two teenagers, they now live south of London, where he teaches and writes. He is an avid student of the scriptures, finding and sharing parallels between these two passions. Yeah, Revelation and geology. We've had a lot of programs here, Ryan, on topics related to geology, and many programs on topics related to Revelation and eschatology, but I'm not sure we've ever had one where we've fused both together. And so this is a first, which is another reason why I'm very excited for this. Therefore, Ryan, let's just get into your presentation. I'll throw it over to you whenever you're ready. You can get your slides up. I did see your slides at the bottom of the screen, but now I don't.
You're right. They went away.
Which is fine. It's probably just asking you to reshare. And as you do that, I do see it coming up. I'll let the audience know. As usual with these programs, we will be interactive. We'll be having a audience Q&A once we're done with Ryan's presentation. and a Q&A from myself, as well as I've got some of my own questions, and we'll have a good solid discussion after Ryan's talk here. I got your slide now up, and Ryan, the floor is yours, brother. Go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah. So it's awesome that you mentioned that you have like eschatology topics and geology topics on your channel, which is unusual, right? A lot of channels try to just focus it on one thing. And that's why I was so excited to come on your channel. Is like, yes, perfect. Finally, someone who's got these two things, and we're just going to put them together. So, yeah. As you know, I kind of went a little in detail on the last episode we did, and really just kind of showcase the fact that I am a creation scientist. I do have data that I've collected, fracture data that points to a global flood, and that I looked at the book of Genesis, right, the beginning of the Bible. So I'm pretty standard creation scientist when it comes to that. But a little bit of a twist, right? A little bit of a difference, and that I think that there's a lot of geology and revelation that points back to the creator as well. And so I've been excited about tonight's topic ever since we talked about doing this. The first one was just kind of more of an intro, just talking about the extension in the crust that happened after the flood. First, you had compression, right, that brought the mountains up. The mountains rose up, and then the floodwaters drained off. And then you've got extension after that as the mountains begin to actually collapse and the valleys sink down. And that was last episode back in May. And then this one, we're going to take that extension that continues, right, and we're going to take it right on through Jesus' second coming, and right on through eventually all the way to the lake of fire. And I'm going to talk about how all of that, just like Noah's flood was a geologic catastrophe, so the signs of the end that are talked about in Revelation, and ultimately the lake of fire, hell, in other words, is also a geologic catastrophe. But there's hope, right? And I'm not going to leave you hanging on what that hope is. I'm just going to tell you right now, and that is the New Jerusalem is our ark. It's this generation's ark, right? And those who get on or into the New Jerusalem are going to be saved from these geologic catastrophes. And so the whole point of these geologic catastrophes isn't to necessarily judge the world and punish the wicked. It's to wake people up and say, hey, this is increasing. It's getting worse. And you need to, go to your source of life. Right? You need to get on board the boat. In this case, the New Jerusalem. It's big enough, man. It's 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles square, and that's plenty big enough for all of us to get on board. So, yeah, geology and revelation points to creator. So, this is what I talk about in my book. It's called Revelations Geology. And just to kind of kick things off, I'm going to share the first geologic indicator in the book from Revelation 6:14. These are in the seals of Revelation. All right. This is the sixth seal specifically, where it says, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. Obviously, it's talking about a great earthquake there. It goes so far as to say that, there'll be a great earthquake associated with these things. And not only that, but these mountains and islands moving around have to be from some major tectonic extension that's going on, right? These mountains are moving and collapsing back into the sea. So this is the kind of the final result and renewed extension that it's kind of been dormant ever since the last few centuries after the global flood. Has been dormant since then. And that's what we talked about in episode 1, but it's going to come back, and it's going to come back in a big way. I think that's what Revelation is trying to tell us. And then at the end of the book, end of Revelation, in verse 20, verse 14, it says, and anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Okay, so the final end of evil at the end of the book, at the end of the Bible, right, is a lake of fire. So first you have a global catastrophe, Noah's flood, right? The earth is deluged in water. And then you have, at the end of the story, you have a lake of fire in which the earth is again cleansed of evil. So this is kind of bookending Revelation, but remember, like Genesis and Revelation, both, the entire Bible is bookended by these geologic catastrophes, right? So, first off, if you didn't know, Revelation's second most common word is G, all right, which is the root of the word geology. So, the first most common word is theo, right, in the Greek, which means God. So first you have God in Revelation, and then you have the earth, or geology. And so Revelation is actually really a book about geology, which, has been kind of, well, it hasn't been really understood at this point. So I'm here to kind of throw some ideas out there. And I'm not going to say that these are the absolute way things are going to happen and shake out. I just want to throw out a potential hypothesis, right? With the whole goal being, the central message of Revelation is to fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea and the springs of water, right? And that's right in the middle of the book, Revelation 14:7, the first angel's message. And so really all these, when we're thinking about geology, right, and the earth and the power that the creator has over the earth, when he demonstrates that power, it's a call back to worship him as the creator, right? Because he can manipulate things on the earth. He can do things on the earth that we'd be like, wow, that's supernatural, right? But he's like, oh no, that's just any other Tuesday, right? Well, of course, these things won't be any other Tuesday for us. They're going to be some pretty big deal, but I want to make sure that as we talk about this, that you just keep in mind that these things are not something that we need to fear, but there's something that is coming to call us back to the creator, and do it in probably the most, the loudest way possible, right? Get the most people's attention. So if we go back all the way to like Job, which is thought to be even older than Genesis, right, as far as when it was written. Well, one of the things that's talked about there at the very end of the book is this monster creature called Leviathan. And the reason I bring this up is because I want you to be thinking about the purpose of why God talked about Leviathan, and the purpose of why we're going to have these geologic events at the end of time. They both serve the same purpose, right? It's to call attention back to the creator. So Leviathan probably, I think, was probably like a 10-meter long Dinosuchus, an extinct crocodile. Here I have a picture from the South Dakota School of Mines of a modern crocodile skull and a Dinosuchus crocodile skull. These things were fearsome crocodiles, right? And God calls attention to them in the book of Job in chapter 41 as a way of saying, look, I made this amazing creature. He's tough. He's, strong. He's, more than you want to take on. And, so honor me, right? I'm the creator. And so these big events that are coming are basically just doing the same thing that like these major Dinosuchus animals did, right? Was call attention to the creator. So these prophesied geologic catastrophes point humanity back to the creator. That's their purpose, not to punish the wicked and from some, vengeful deity. Our God is a God of love, right? It's to warn people and point them back. So I'm going to kind of talk about my book a little bit in reverse. So we're going to go kind of towards the end of the book, and I'm going to dive right in with some of the time prophecies in the Bible. And you'll see why I'm going to start off with this as we go along here. So we have these parallel prophecies in the Bible. They're each in the context of worldwide conflict, which, some people are wondering, is that coming around the corner pretty quick here? There's persecution of the saints involved, and ultimately there's a final judgment of the wicked and salvation of the righteous. And it's all presented in these parallel prophecies. We kind of got to ask ourselves, do they cover the same time, right? So there's actually 7 mentions of a time period that's approximately 3.5 years. So in Daniel, as well as one time in Revelation, it's referred to as a time, times, and half a time. So 1 year, 2 years, and a half a year. So 3.5 years, right? Revelation also calls it a period of 42 months, twice, and 1,260 days, again, twice, right? So, and again, they all have the same context of worldwide conflict, persecution, final judgment, and salvation. So we think that they're parallel. But there's a problem, okay? And that is these times don't line up, right? 1,260 days does not equal 42 months, does not equal 3.5 years. What do they equal? Okay, 1 month is equal to 29.52 days. So if you multiply that by 42, you get 1,240.26 days. Okay, you take 1 year, which is 365.26 days, multiply it by 3.5, and you get 1,278.41 days. Neither of those are equal to 1,260. So how do we solve these problems? Some potential solutions we can propose, right? As scientists, we like to try and come up with all the solutions. I'm just going to present a few of them here. The ones that the ones that easily come to mind. There may be more out there. We'll talk about them, right? So we can assume that these 7 time prophecies are not really the same time period, even though they're very close, right? There's only about 20 days difference between them. So, all right, let's assume that they are not the same. Problem with that is it ignores the context. As I said, we have worldwide conflict, persecution, and a final judgment and salvation. All right, so scratch that. Maybe let's think of another solution here. How can we solve this problem? Well, let's use a, quote, Jewish or a prophetic calendar of 360 days per year. The math works out in that case. Problem is, the Jewish calendar at the time these prophecies were written, at the time of Daniel and the time of John, time of Jesus, right? They had alternating months of 29 or 30 days. So if you take 6 times 29 and 6 times 30, you get a year that is 354 days, not 360. And this is probably the most common go-to. It doesn't really work. So there's another solution. Shorten the number of days in the year. But hopefully you're thinking the same thing as I am. That's kind of impossible, right? It's based on the orbit of the Earth around the sun. You can't really change that. Not going to happen. Well, remember that with men, things that are impossible are possible to God. And in fact, Jesus goes further in speaking of the end of days. He says, unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the days. So I'd always wondered, what does it mean shorten the days? So the rotation of the Earth going to change? Is the orbit of the Earth going to change? Is he just going to decide that he's going to come back sooner than what he planned? What does it mean? He's shortened the days, right? It's a cliffhanger here. I'm trying to understand this, right? It wasn't until very recently that it suddenly dawned on me. 1,278 days minus 1,268 days. 1,260 days is shorter by 18.41 days. Could this possibly be what is meant, right? Okay, so what we think is impossible, God can actually do. He actually says the days are going to be shortened. So somehow is our current 3.5 years that are 365 days each, is our year going to shorten so that it is 1,260 days? So, okay, how do we do that? Well, we can slow down the rotation of the Earth, right? That's one way. Problem with doing that, it would lengthen each day by about 21 minutes. Not shorten the days, but lengthen the days, right? You slow the Earth's rotation down, the day gets longer, and you have fewer days in the year then. Okay, so you could get 360 days in the year if you slow the Earth's rotation, but each day would be longer. Okay, and there's another problem on top of that, is that it would not make the 42 months equal to 3.5 years and 1,260 days, because the length of the month wouldn't change. Okay, so you can't do it by just changing the rotation of the Earth. The other option then is to slip the Earth's orbit closer to the sun. So the distance that you would actually have to slip the Earth closer to the sun in order to accomplish a 360-day year is actually less than half the distance between what's called perihelion and aphelion. This is the closest approach of the sun, of the Earth to the sun, and the furthest distance from the sun. Remember, the Earth's orbit is slightly, very slightly elliptical. Okay. And so there is a point, and this is part of the reason why we have seasons. There is a point at which it is a little closer to the sun, a point where it's a little further than the sun. And the difference between perihelion and aphelion is about 5 million kilometers. Okay. Now, the distance that you would have to move the Earth closer to the sun, the average distance, right? You'd have to move the average distance about 2 million kilometers closer to the sun, or about 1.5% closer to the sun than what it is now, in order to get a 360-day year, right? If you did that, then 1,260 years would equal a time times and a half, right? And then you could keep the context of these prophecies intact, and you could say, yeah, these are parallel prophecies, right? Okay, so this is a possibility. Well, before we go to the science of it, let's just stay with Scripture. And there's a lot of times where it talks about actually not just the earth shaking, right? Not just earthquakes, but the heavens shaking. How do you shake the heavens, right? But God says, therefore, I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place, or out of her usual position. Is another way to translate the Hebrew there. Okay. Also, and this one just completely blew my mind when I read it. The foundations of the earth leap. Now, I've changed the color there and put in the word leap. Most of my scripture references today come from the New King James Version, but this, I've changed that one word because I've gone back to the original Hebrew, and I think this word is a better way to describe the Hebrew word ra'ash. Okay. Anyway, I'll come back to that in a moment. But so the foundations of the earth leap, or ra'ash. The earth is violently broken. The earth is split open. The earth slips continually. So here again, I've taken a Hebrew word. The Hebrew word is mot, and it actually shows up twice, mot, mot. And when the Hebrew puts two words that are the same right next to each other, it means it's a perfection or completion, right? So instead of saying, perfect peace in the Bible, it says actually shalom, shalom. Like it's doubling down on shalom, peace, right? So it means perfect peace in our understanding, but it uses the same word twice. So instead of saying slips, right, I would say slips completely in English, or fully, perfectly, right? From the Hebrew word mot. So let's take a look at those two words. And of course, you can go to Strong's, right, and it'll give you a sense of what these words mean. These are two of the handful of words in the Hebrew that describe the different ways in which the earth shakes during earthquakes, right? There's actually, because, the Hebrews lived in an area where earthquakes were quite common. And so having a vocabulary to describe the different ways that the earth moves during an earthquake is not surprising, right? It's like going to an Eskimo and they've got, 30 some different words for the different kinds of snow, right? Hebrews have a lot of different words for earthquakes and shaking, and these are two of them. All right, so the word ra'ash actually also shows up in Job. So you can go to Strong's, or you can go to the Bible and you can try and look at other places where the word shows up and kind of try and understand the meaning of the word based on where else it shows up, right? And the context there. So in Job, Ra'ash is used to actually refer to a locust leaping, okay, or jumping from one place to another. You know, the locust is here and then it's over there, right? And it's always surprising when you're walking along and suddenly this locust or grasshopper, it's got their wings and it's in brrr, and they're over there, right? It's kind of like, oh, it's startling, right? It happens quickly and then it's over, right? So that's the word that Ra'ash. Okay, and it's also found in Job. The word mot is also found in Psalms 17, verse 5, and I'm just going to read it for you here. It says, uphold my steps in your paths, that my footsteps may not slip. All right, so actually the New King James does translate the word mot as slip. But in this instance, I believe it translates it as shaken, utterly shaken. Well, okay, is that the best way? Foundations of the earth shake, the earth is violently broken, and then we see shaken again. They're both translated shaken, but you lose some of the meaning, right? Unless you go back to the Hebrew. So think about a foot, right? In a pair of flip-flops or sandals, right? You're walking along and that foot's going to slip out, which actually, that's exactly the way I, as a geologist, would describe how a fault moves, right? It's two blocks of rock that are slipping past each other, just like a foot slipping in a pair of sandals on a hot, sweaty day. And so the Hebrew is kind of, you lose that, right, in the English translation. So mot really means slip, all right? And when I read that, I'm going, oh, okay, earthquake. But in this case, it says the earth slips and the foundations of the earth leap. All right, there's a lot more to this. Remember, the earth is hung on nothing, according to Job, right? God says, hung the earth on nothing. So the foundations of the earth are nothing. But it does rest on the fabric of space-time, right? And if there's some kind of gravitational anomaly or something that, passes the Earth, or something could cause the Earth's orbit to leap or slip along the fabric of space-time and move, right? The Earth's orbit could change. And I think that's what the Hebrew possibly is trying to tell us, right? It's a hypothesis. It's an idea. It's just, you're right, it's speculation, all right? But let's face it, pretty much when we look at Bible prophecy, until it happens, it's all speculation anyway. So it's not like we really know what's going to happen. So I'm just proposing another idea out here for you to consider. All right. Not that it's necessarily the way things are going to happen. But okay, so if we have an orbital slip, if the Earth moves closer to the sun, then it's possible that 1,260 days could equal 3.5 years. And along with that, the orbit of the moon might change as well. And so, 42 months might become equal to that as well. All right, so this is all astronomical at this point. And I do want to get back into the geology of things. But before we do that, let's talk about asters in prophecy. So aster is actually the Greek word that's translated star. So whenever you see star in the Bible, think aster, right? And it's also the Greek word from which we get the word asteroid or star-like. So in Luke, Jesus is talking. This is the same discourse as where he talked about in Mark, just a few slides back. So he says, there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven, men's hearts failing them for fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth or moving towards the earth. Okay. We've all heard about the falling stars, right? There's lots of references to that in scripture. But I want to point out for your attention that 3 of the 7 trumpets in Revelation have to do with falling stars hitting the earth. All right, so you have the second trumpet, you have a great mountain burning with fire, Revelation 8:8. The third trumpet, a great star fallen from heaven, burning like a torch. This is the one they call wormwood, right? Revelation 8:10. And the fifth, a star fallen from heaven to earth, Revelation 9:1. And then, like I said, there's many other references out there as well. So if you've got these celestial events going on, right? And here, what's kind of being portrayed is possibly a series of asteroid impacts, kind of like the don't know how many of you are familiar or were around in the 90s. I was a teenager at the time. 1994, the Shoemaker-Levy 9 series of comets that hit Jupiter, right? Something like that may be going on again here, where we see a series of asteroids that are hitting the Earth. Well, what if one of them is a miss, right? Maybe the big one is a near miss. We've got these little ones that are hitting, the second, third, fifth trumpets, right? Maybe the big one's a miss, and maybe it has enough gravity that it can cause Earth's orbit to shift closer to the sun. That's one potential way you could create the Earth's, cause the Earth's orbit to shift. Another way, maybe something with the Earth's eccentricity, the ellipticity of the orbit changes, the gravity of the sun, maybe a rogue planet. I know people like to talk about, Planet Nibiru on YouTube, right? That's popular because it has that fear, that clickbait, get everyone, afraid for their lives and watching your YouTube videos. But, I'm not an astronomer. I'm not going to speculate on anything more. I'm just going to say, look, there are what appear to be asteroids in Revelation. An asteroid maybe could potentially cause the Earth to slip. Like, you can just kind of see how these different puzzle pieces kind of look like they could fit together. I'm not saying they do, right? It's going to be hard to tell that they do until it actually happens, but they could, right? And that's the point of what I'm sharing with you today is show you another way to think about Revelation, a literal way to think about Revelation, maybe less symbolic that, this star represents someone that falls, but an actual literal star, just like it says, right? All right, so let's dive into what the consequences of the Earth moving closer to the sun. Of course, if the Earth moved closer to the sun, you would have real global warming. Not the stuff that's in the media today, right? We're not talking about the climate change agenda. We're talking about real, honest to goodness global warming. The Earth is closer to the sun. It's going to heat up, okay? It's not much closer to the sun. It's not like this is going to be, well, actually, I take that back. World ending, right? It could be world ending. And I think that's what Revelation is telling us. But we'll get there. But it's not like there's not hope, right? It's not like God doesn't preserve you. I mean, if you go to Revelation, you read about passing through the valley of the shadow of death, and God sheltering you under the shadow of His wings, right? So there's a lot of hope for us who believe in our Creator that there's going to be some shade when there's desertification going on, right? In the fourth bowl, it talks about men being scorched with great heat. Well, go figure. You just had a bunch of asteroids going by. You may have had a gravitational pull and the Earth's orbit slip, and we're closer to the sun, Earth being scorched with great heat. Revelation 16:9, right? You can kind of start to see how the bowls and trumpets actually really fit together in kind of like this chain of series of events that really are all tied together, okay? The sixth bowl, the great river Euphrates, and its water dries up, right, to prepare the way of the kings from the east. Okay, so desertification, obvious, easy to explain. The Earth is closer to the sun, right? Real global warming, natural global warming, not something that's caused by pollution and man, not a climate change agenda, okay? What else are you going to have? You're going to have rising sea level. So obviously the Earth is closer to the sun. You're going to have melting ice. And not just the polar caps, the ice sheets, Antarctica, Greenland, the glaciers, not just those things melting, but also the oceans, because the water is warmer. When things warm, they expand, right? So just from thermal expansion, the sea level rises. And what do we see in Revelation? So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood. So there's some flooding. What I'm showing here is actually a map of what the Holy Land would look like, okay, if sea level rose by about 65 meters. Now, why 65 meters? 65 meters is the amount sea level would rise if all the ice on Earth melted. All right, you move the Earth closer to the sun, ice melts, and suddenly, the Dead Sea is connected to the Mediterranean Sea. Go check out Ezekiel, or if you're not sure where the references are in Ezekiel, check out my book. I'll give you the references there, and I'll go into more detail. And yeah, this whole area could be connected up, all right, in one great big arm of the sea. Also, all right, if the oceans are expanding, right, the water's expanding a little bit, the molecules are moving further apart because they're warmer, the crust of the Earth is going to do the exact same thing. That's going to lead to rifting. Okay, the crust of the Earth is going to be breaking apart. Revelation 12 also says the Earth opened its mouth. Okay, which is an exact quote of Exodus 16. Sorry, I think that reference is actually number 16. Number 16, where Korah, Dathan, and Abiram are swallowed up in a fracture that opens up. The earth opens its mouth, and they're swallowed up because of their rebellion. All right, number 16. And so here you have kind of a tie between Revelation and Numbers, right? We know where Numbers occurred. Numbers occurred there in Arabia, right? In the Sinai desert, somewhere where the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness. In Revelation, we have the earth opening up again. Extensional stress regime, extensional tectonics are going on here, okay? This is at the end of time. And, the Earth's crust is warming, it's opening up. But is it possible that when Revelation 12 talks about the wilderness, that it's talking about the same wilderness, same geologic setting, same extensional stress? Okay. Anyway, I'll leave that for my book as well. Okay. So we've got earthquakes, we've got the Earth opening up. Well, what happens when the Earth opens up? When the Earth opens up, you can bring magma up from the mantle of the Earth, and it will extrude onto the surface of the Earth as lava flows, right? Or volcanic eruptions. So one thing I want to point out is when you have crustal extension, okay, it releases the pressure on faults worldwide. Okay, so there'll be an exponential increase in earthquake frequency and magnitude. So the earthquakes will become more numerous and bigger, which is exactly what Jesus talks about, right? He talks about earthquakes increasing towards the end of time. And magnitude, the size of the earthquakes, would also increase under the scenario that I'm talking about here, right? They'd be much bigger earthquakes than anything we've experienced so far to date, okay? So picture this, right? If you take your hands and you push them together, you apply some pressure, and then you try to move your hands past each other, they're not going to really slip, right? But as soon as you release that stress, you warm up the crust and you release that stress, suddenly those fault blocks can move past each other and those earthquakes can go into hyperactivity. All right, suddenly you've got a lot more earthquakes and bigger ones, okay? Those rifts, fractures open up. That allows volcanic activity to likewise increase exponentially. Here actually is a fracture in Saudi Arabia in 2018. This one, they say it was 28 kilometers long. And this opened up in the exact same area of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And, just throw it out there. Possibly the same area where the woman of Revelation 12 flees to. Anyway, it's an extensional geologic setting where cracks are forming today, but we're talking much bigger cracks and cracks that will be big enough to then extrude lava, right? So magma rises through those new fractures, right? Here's a cutaway of a volcano. You can see that you've got fractures going down into the mantle, and then that magma is rising and exploding out the top of the volcano. Of course, when that happens, you have a lot of volcanic ash that then spreads out over the earth. I was just telling Donny before we started our show today that I was in France, in Nice, a week ago, and looking out over the Mediterranean Ocean, it was rather hazy, and it was rather difficult to see the distinction between where the sea began and the sky ended, right? And the reason for that is because of the Canadian wildfires. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but wildfires in Canada, okay, across the entire Atlantic Ocean, were putting out enough particles, enough soot into the air to create a hazy weather condition in France. All right, now think about the fact that the entire Earth's crust is warming because the Earth is 1% closer to the sun. All right, so it's getting a little bit warmer. The number of fractures that are going to be opening up, the number of earthquakes around the world going exponential, right? And suddenly you're going to have a lot of ash being thrown into the atmosphere through volcanic activity. So we have the fifth trumpet, where it talks about smoke arising out of the pit, like the smoke of a great furnace. So the sun and the air were darkened because of the smoke of the pit. Oh, this happened, remember, I already just mentioned the fifth trumpet being one of the asteroids, the star fallen from heaven, unlocks the bottomless pit and smoke comes out. So, right, okay, all right. So you have something with asteroids, something celestial going on, and something geologically on Earth going on. That is then, you got all this ash coming out. All right, and so here's actually Steve Austin, another creation scientist out there, put together this diagram here. In the gray here, you can see the ash fall where it blanketed the Earth from the Mount St. Helens explosion, and that's tiny. The volume of ash that Mount St. Helens put out in 1980 was 45 years ago. It's tiny compared to the amount of ash from volcanic eruptions like Yellowstone, or this big red box here is the Independence Dyke Swarm, right? Tiny amount of ash. The amount of ash that we're talking about in Revelation is a lot more, right? And so you have the fourth trumpet. A third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars. So the third of them were darkened. A third of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. Okay, I think this could be referring to the fact that not that you actually stuck a third of the stars, right? That's kind of hard to do. How many billions or trillions of stars are there to strike a third of them? I think what this is saying is that it has the appearance of them being struck, right? They're hidden from view by this darkness. Fifth bowl, again, talks about darkness, talks about the evil kingdom becoming full of darkness. It actually says they gnawed their tongues because of the pain. So this isn't just like some kind of solar eclipse kind of darkness. There's actually something in the darkness, all right, which is exactly what you'd have with volcanic ash, right? You have in volcanic ash little shards of volcanic glass. That is painful, right? It gets into your eyes, into your nose, into your lungs, irritates the linings of your throat, okay? Volcanic ash, not fun, okay? So darkness. I think these are all allusions to potentially volcanic ash. And I think that because it fits when you tie all these different trumpets and bowls together geologically. In Exodus, if we go back to Exodus, right? We've already done that once, but let's go back to the plagues of Exodus. And because the plagues of Revelation kind of tend to parallel the plagues of Exodus, there was a plague of darkness in Exodus. It says that there was darkness which may even be felt. The Hebrew word was mashash, meaning it was a thick darkness. It could be felt. You don't feel your way through darkness from an eclipse. You don't feel your way through, a solar eclipse, that darkness. You don't feel your way through the darkness of night, right? You feel your way through a volcanic darkness where you can actually feel those particles hanging in the air, or a dust storm, right? That's another hypothesis. So this isn't the only place that days of darkness are talked about. Joel 2 and Zephaniah 1:5 both talk about a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. All right, this is really gloomy. There's a little light, coming through, but it's thick. right? It's feelable, it's painful. Psalms talks about clouds and darkness surround him. Now, where did the psalmist get this language? It comes directly from Sinai. Okay, this visual imagery comes directly from the events of Mount Sinai, where it uses these exact same Hebrew words to describe clouds and darkness surrounding him. Clouds and darkness surround him, a fire goes before him and burns up his enemies round about. Now, there was no enemies being burned up at Mount Sinai, but there will be in the future, right? It says, lightnings light the world, the earth sees and trembles. Again, another word for earthquakes. The mountains melt. Well, definitely sounds like a volcanic eruption to me. Mountains melt in the presence of Yahweh of the whole earth, right? So this is, again, it's just showing God's power as creator over his creation. But despite all this scary stuff that's going on, right? Ezekiel says, so I seek out my sheep and deliver them from all the places where they were scattered on a cloudy and dark day. Wow. So God's people scattered all over the earth, all these crazy geologic phenomenon going on, and they are delivered, right? They're gathered and delivered. God finds them and rescues them. That's the good news, guys. That is the good news. But no matter what's coming, wherever you are in the world, no matter how dark and cloudy and scary it gets, God's there to find you, his sheep. All right, so collapsing mountains is another geologic prophecy in Scripture. Now, what you're seeing here is a picture of the White Cliffs actually collapsing into the English Channel. Okay, this is not what we're talking about here. All right, yes, the mountains, the cliffs are collapsing into the sea. This is, a pretty big event. It'll make the national news, of course. It's not what we're talking about, something way bigger. We're talking about mountains collapsing into the sea, okay, which you get when you have an extensional stress regime, okay? So Psalms 46 says, therefore we will not fear, even though the earth be removed. Orbital slip. Yeah, maybe, okay. And though the mountains slip, here's that word, that Hebrew word molt again, even though the mountains slip into the midst of the sea, all right? And this is actually quoted by Jesus then, where he says, if you were to say to this mountain, be removed and cast into the sea, it will be done. So, wow, not only should you not fear these things coming up, but you might actually be one of the faithful to actually tell the mountain to slip, and it'll slip. I mean, talk about God's power moving through his people at the end times, right? He's set up all these fault planes around the earth, just waiting there for his people's faith to grow to the point where they can say, you know what? No, this mountain's in the way. It's got to go. Eventually, in Revelation, every mountain and island was moved out of its place. So we talk about that. I talked about that verse at the very beginning, right? Every mountain and island being moved out of their place. So you've got extension that begins, right? The earth moves closer to the sun, a little extension begins, earthquakes start increasing, volcanoes start going off, but eventually every mountain island gets moved out of its place, right? So this is building to a crescendo. Okay, that's the sixth seal. The seventh bowl, seventh trumpet as well, but this quote is Revelation 16 from the seventh bowl. It says, then every island fled away and the mountains were not found, right? And this is at the very end of these signs of Revelation, right? The seventh bowl, in which is portrayed the second coming of Jesus. So like right up to the second coming, then that's where this is increasing in intensity, and then the righteous are saved, right? It even goes so far as to say the Mount of Olives shall be split in two in Zechariah 14. Wow, that's a pretty bold geologic statement right there, but it fits. It fits with the extensional tectonics of the Holy Land today, as well as the extensional tectonics that would be increased in intensity if the Earth were to slip closer to the sun, in order for 1260 days to equal 3.5 years, right? So I'm pretty excited for some of the comments. I'm sure there's going to be lots of great questions and comments, but we'll just kind of wrap it up here in the next, I don't know, 5 slides maybe. So if you go back to the episode previously back in May, I showed you a lot more technical slides. This one's a lot more Bible verse heavy. But in the last slide, we talked about the geology, right after, kind of at the tail end of the flood and proceeding the years after the flood, where you had these mountains rise up and then they backslid. All right. And I showed you the fracture data that actually backs up this model that I'm showing you here. This model explains how mountains rose after the flood, but it also shows how are they perfectly set up to collapse. They have collapsed a little bit, but they are set up to fully collapse in the future. You get enough extension on those things, these faults are going to reactivate. Instead of bringing the mountains up, they're going to allow the mountains to do what we call, as a geologist, we call it backsliding on those same exact faults, backslide right back down into the ocean. All right. So this has some very interesting, theological implications. Okay, as we move forward, as these geologic events build to a crescendo, actually the days of creation are fully reversed. So I'm just going to walk you through this here, so bear with me. Okay, the 6th day. All right, Jeremiah 4, which is very, very parallel to Revelation 20. Okay, Jeremiah 4 talking about the day of judgment. He says, at the end of that day, indeed, there was no man. All right, man was created the 6th day. At the end of the day of Yahweh, no man. Day 6, reversed. Okay, 5th day. Every living creature in the sea died. Revelation 16:3. This is the second trumpet bowl or trumpet, I forget. Okay. Jeremiah 4:25 also says all the birds of heaven fled. Remember, it was created on the 5th day. Sea creatures and the birds. Here they are, gone. Okay. Day 4. You guys know it was created on the 4th day. The sun, moon, and stars were allowed to shine. Their light reached the surface of the earth. 4th day, we have where it says 1/3 of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. Okay, this again is the 4th trumpet. Reversal of the 4th day of creation. 3rd day, 1/3 of the trees were burned up. This is the second trumpet. And all green grass was burned up. All green grass, right? These are things that are created on the 3rd day, right? All the plants are created on the 3rd day. It also says every mountain and island was moved out of its place. So if you remember what happened on the 3rd day, God separated the land from the water, right? Possibly referring to tectonic movement. All right, and here you have the land, the mountains and islands returning. They're moved out of their place. And as Jesus says, they collapse into the sea. All right, so you have a reversal of even the tectonic movement of the 3rd day. 2nd day, Peter says that the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Isaiah says that all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. Atmosphere created on day 2, gone like a scroll. If you didn't think the birds and the plants and the animals and the humans were around at this time, well, you take away the atmosphere, nothing left to breathe, and all those things are going to be gone. Thank goodness that what's being referred to here is actually Jesus' second coming, right? He is coming at just the right moment to save the righteous from the fact that the atmosphere is out of here. the first day, right? Jeremiah again. It says, I behold the earth, and indeed it was without form and void, and the heavens, they had no light, right? The very first thing God created was light. Here, Jeremiah is saying, heavens have no light. And it's actually the only other place in Scripture where the Hebrew phrase, the tohu wabohu, is used. Okay, Genesis uses the phrase tohu wabohu to refer to the earth in its pre-created state. Okay, there was something here, some kind of lump, some kind of rock, don't know exactly, but there was something here when that light came and then God began creating. There was no life here. And it's going to return to that state, okay, being without form and void, the tohu wabohu, the abyss of Revelation. It's first day. So creation is reversed fully. Wow. I mean, if you weren't scared already by what I've shared, then you should definitely be scared by the fact that eventually what the Bible's saying is there's going to be nothing on this planet that will sustain life, right? Should be scared except for the fact that hopefully you know the rescuer, right? And that is Jesus Christ. He says in John 12:47, if anyone hear my words and does not believe, I don't judge him, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. He came to save the world. Right? That was his first mission. That's his second mission. Right? It's not to hit the earth with all these terrible plagues and kill all these sinners. That's just what's going to happen. And if you're not ready to, be rescued, if you're not willing to get on the ark, and here I have a picture of the ark, right? And a picture of the New Jerusalem. Both, I mean, these are medieval drawings, conceptions of them. So maybe not how you'd exactly picture either of them today, the ark or the New Jerusalem, but nevertheless, there you go, right? These things are parallel, right? You have the ark that floated on the surface of a great deluge. You have the New Jerusalem that floats on the surface of a lake of fire, right? Both are our salvation, right? These are vessels for our salvation. Jesus coming back to rescue people at the very moment the atmosphere is stripped away, right? And he comes in the clouds. And then what happens? Well, Revelation fills in the story right after it talks about the lake of fire. Immediately the next thing, it says, now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Right? So it's a rescue and a recreation, because the earth is it's worn out. All the wickedness, all the evil on the earth have just worn it out to the point where it cannot sustain life. And God comes in, rescues those who want to be rescued, and recreates. Wow, I'm really excited for that day, if you can't tell. So, in summary, the Bible begins and ends with geologic catastrophes that both point to the Creator, a Creator who doesn't like evil, right? He wants us to have a good place to dwell, paradise, right? And so the Bible begins and ends with these catastrophes on earth, point us back to our rescuer. A celestial event could slip the Earth's orbit closer to the sun, maybe about 3.5 years before Jesus returns, whenever that is. I'm not trying to set a date or anything. As the Earth then warms, the crust expands, earthquakes go exponential. You're going to have something completely off the Richter scale. We're talking about mountains collapsing, which is way bigger than anything that has been experienced to date. Volcanoes pumping out millions of cubic meters of ash that fulfill those prophecies of darkness. These things are all tied together. All the trumpets, the bowls, and all these other prophecies from a lot of the Hebrew scriptures, not just the book of Revelation, they all point to these geologic events happening. The culmination, the grand crescendo, is when the lake of fire completely reverses creation. And that's what hell is. It's just a lake of fire in which the earth is cleansed. Right? And then, of course, Jesus rescues us from that. and recreates the earth. Guys, that's what I had for you tonight. So I'm gonna say let's dive into those question and answer. Hopefully, Donnie, there we go.
There we go. Ryan, I love it. The Bible begins and ends with geologic catastrophes that point to the creator, which makes sense because it makes me think of 2 Peter 2 or 2 Peter 3, where it talks about the three events that the scoffers will deny: the creation, the special creation, the world that then was being overflowed with water that perished, therefore the global Genesis flood, not local, and the coming judgment by fire. So it makes sense that there would be this strong correlation of the topic geology. And so I think you've made some really good connections. The creation reversals was really interesting. So Ryan, those creation reversals, are they each going to be billions of years? As
I
an
saw
older
that in
creationist
the
might
chat.
say.
Yeah, man. I don't think people would survive. Even the righteous people would survive if it was billions of years. I think this is where that final 3.5 years comes into play, right? And I think that's why God is so specific in telling us how long that period of time is going to be. It's going to, it's going to start. We can count it down, and it's not going to take that long, and it's going to be fairly benign to start, right? It takes time, but it's going to build in intensity, and just at the end, you can't survive it. That's why Jesus is coming back.
So do you think part of God's plan with the worldwide flood and then the eventual judgment by fire, it was necessary for that pre-flood supercontinent, I guess, as some would say? Perhaps you can touch on how you feel that supercontinent would have been laid out, structured, how it would have looked. But for that to largely break apart during the flood year and the continents move to their present locations for the most part that we see today rapidly rather than over billions of years, like actual scientists would say. Yeah. And so was that a necessary event to eventually lead to what you've been describing in Revelation and another geologic catastrophe, Ryan?
Yeah, I think so. I think, God knows what he's done. He knows the beginning from the end, and everything was preordained and set up, and it's dominoes. There's consequences, right? And this is my personal view of God, is that he's not out there to punish people for making mistakes. It's that there are natural consequences for evil, right? If you go all the way back to Cain and the story of Cain and Abel, right? He says that God said the blood of Abel cried out to him from the earth. It's as if the earth itself was impacted when Cain murdered Abel, right? And that the earth itself was crying out. And so you get this idea that, and it's very Eastern, we don't really think this way in our Western mindset, but in the Eastern Jewish, or I should say, not just Jewish, but Hebrew mindset, right? The concept was that the earth itself, right, acquired all of this built up evil, and that it would reject it, right? You had the fact that God talks about how it was the land that rejected the children of Israel, and that's why they were exiled to Babylon. Like the land itself just vomited them out. And so I think that's what's going on here. Not that God's gonna, be, penalizing the world. He's not an angry, vengeful deity. It's that our actions as humanity, we don't understand these natural laws, but they do impact the earth in some way, and the earth itself will rebel against that at some point. And what is God left to do? Well, he's a God of love and mercy, so he's got to come back and rescue the people who want to be rescued.
Amen. It was just like the time of the flood. Noah was given that 100 to 120 years to preach for people to repent and get saved and avoid that judgment by water, and in the future judgment by fire. One of the many things, Ryan, that I really enjoyed about that presentation is how you take Revelation and demonstrate why we can read it and understand it literally, understanding that these events being described are accurate and not meant to be overly symbolized or overly allegorical like so many have done. We do a lot of debates here and panel discussions on all things eschatology, and there are many different groups or persuasions in the world of end time theology, one being the preterists, where most or even all of these events have happened. And what they do is they take an approach to Revelation where they allegorize and symbolize everything and stick most of it in first century AD with that 7-year Jewish Roman war from 66 to 73 AD. But you're showing that no, we can take what Revelation is describing with the seals, but primarily the trumpets and the vials or the bowls, and we can understand them literally as these are events that are going to be happening. The descriptions are geologic in nature, and all this works, Ryan.
Yeah, absolutely, Donnie. And you mentioned like preterists, and there's lots of ways that prophecy can be interpreted, and I think that it's open for that, and there's a reason for that, right? I mean, they have a point. The temple was destroyed. The stones of the temple were cast down. I'm referring to Matthew 24, of course.
Right.
But Ezekiel talks about every wall coming down, and you still got the western wall with even bigger stones that haven't come down. But what I'm describing will bring stones that big. If it can split the Mount of Olives, it'll bring those stones of the western wall down too. And so you can have these prior fulfillments, partial fulfillments, but there's something bigger coming, right?
Right.
And
yeah.
And I don't want to discount the symbolic. I don't, in my book, I don't talk about like the beast. I don't talk about the false prophet. I don't talk about the woman, right? All these symbols in Revelation, because those are clearly symbolic. But even the star falling from heaven to earth, you could apply it symbolically, right? And I think that what often happens is we don't realize that oftentimes the symbolic and the literal go hand in hand, right?
Yeah.
You'll have something. I mean, think about the phrase cloudy and thick darkness, and you think about what's going on politically in the world today, and you think, man, is it cloudy, right? So there's a symbolic and potentially literal where it could get real cloudy in a symbolic sense, religious, political, and real cloudy in a literal sense from ash clouds.
Yeah. No, and God's word is that deep. And I think you nailed it there, that we can have these small scale examples in the past. We can have these localized fulfillments like in 70 AD, specifically that 7-year Jewish Roman war, which I think we can find details and small scale fulfillments in Matthew 24 that are really just pointing to the end game, which you largely described in your presentation, where now we're not dealing with local fulfillments or these small scale events or catastrophes, but now we're dealing with that which is worldwide. Because clearly what you presented, these are catastrophic events that have a worldwide impact. Where in 70 AD, that was a huge event, that war, but it was localized. People that lived really far from that area that this war was taking place in probably weren't even aware of it for the most part. So I think you make some good points there. One thing I really appreciate about Revelation is a lot of the times when we are looking at something that is symbolic or meant to be allegorical, the Bible will tell us what the meaning is. And so we don't really have to guess. Like, for example, it talks about the dragon, the serpent, which is the devil.
Yeah.
Or in Revelation, I think it's in Revelation 1, where it talks about the 7 stars and the 7 golden candlesticks. At first, if you don't continue reading, you might wonder, well, what are those? Well, when you get to the end of the chapter, it says the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks are the 7 churches. So oftentimes, you'll have something that is symbolic, but then it'll tell you what that is. So we don't really have to guess.
My sound cut out. Hold on.
Is my sound coming in now, Ryan? No. We'll let Ryan figure out the sound. Yeah, he probably can't hear me.
Yeah, so, there we go. Now it's back. All right.
Okay. No worries.
I'm glad you're saying the 7 candlesticks and the 7. Yeah.
Yeah. In my discussions with people of, let's say, the preterist persuasion, they'll oftentimes make the argument that, well, there's not too much we can get from Revelation because of the symbolism and allegory. But I just like to point out, well, oftentimes where there is an aspect or a moment of symbolism, it'll tell us what that. I mean, obviously, we don't have to guess what the dragon is. It tells us that that's the devil. But you made some really interesting points here that the chat commented on. For example, here, thanks, Dad, and this appreciate the comment. And I had these same thoughts. He says, "Oh wow, I never thought of that verse in that way. Ash and such covering the planet, blocking the sky and gnawing their tongues. This fits so well with volcanism." Before you give your thoughts, Ryan, that's what I was thinking during your presentation, brother, was that you have this ripple effect. And I guess that's what you'd also see during the flood year, where the fountains of the great deep break open. And then from there, you have a series of events that result because of that. And in the end times, you have this series of events, one after another, because it's a ripple effect of what's occurring.
Yeah. Going back to the flood, right? It wasn't just a flood, right? You had major earthquakes going on under the water, because you have all these tectonic movements, catastrophic plate tectonic movements, in which you have major mountain chains being born, right? They're going from a flat plain as these two continents collide together, and suddenly, boom, you've got the Himalayan mountains and Mount Everest, poking its way up out of the water. And so these earthquakes are going on. You've got volcanism associated with that. You've got so many different geologic processes besides just flooding, right? And you've got the exact same thing going on at the end of time and what's being portrayed in Revelation, minus the flooding. There's some local floods that point out, rising sea level, but you've got all these same earthquakes going on in reverse as the mountains collapse, right? And so, but now you don't have the fact that it's an arc riding above the waves and you're not really experiencing these earthquakes. Suddenly we're experiencing these earthquakes and they're going to be way bigger than a 10.0. I think the largest earthquake we've ever experienced was the one in Alaska. It was like a 9.4 or 9.6 on the Richter scale. And what we're talking about here, is whole mountains collapsing, which would be way beyond that.
Yeah, I think it's incredible. I think you've made some really good connections there, Ryan, and it fits perfectly with what the title says. Geology and Revelation points to the Creator. It should encourage people who are not Christians, who are not saved, to take these things seriously, and because the Bible does warn us that there's a judgment by fire to come. Lynn Mitzi has a good question. What are the chances, with all the shaking and moving taking place in the end times, of the continents coming back to a sort of Pangea-like form?
Yeah. So I think the chance of that is pretty limited, actually, because, things kind of tend towards more disorder, right? So whatever ordered crust there was in the pre-flood world got, we call Pangea, of course, but I'm sure it had a much different shape than what we know of as Pangea, because we can't account for all the erosion. We don't know, how much of it eroded off, right? So that shape that we call Pangea probably isn't realistic for the pre-flood world either. But that broke apart. And if things continue towards disorder, right, we're talking about even more breaking apart. Okay. And so we're not talking about necessarily the continents moving back together. We're just talking about the highs, the mountains collapsing back so that everything's kind of flat again. And then the entire crust of the earth being remelted, right? So every plate tectonic plate that we think about is remelted, and that then sets up the ability. Well, I shouldn't say the ability, because God has infinite ability to do whatever He wants, but it's a blank slate, right? It's just like returning the Earth to the state that it was with no continents, nothing, right? There's not even water on the surface of the Earth at this point, right? Remember, water was created during Creation Week, or it just kind of covered the Earth. So we've got this lake of fire that's burning all that off and destroying any remnants of continents, any remnants of civilization, remnants of cities, remnants of whatever it is. And then from that blank slate, then God creates whatever new, quote, Pangea, right? I'm sure it'll be completely different and way better. But yeah. And that's where God steps in and takes all that disorder and makes order, right? That's what creation is.
Amen. We look forward to that. We know who wins in the end, that's for sure. And so it makes me wonder, and therefore I'll ask you the question. 2 Peter 3, the scoffers are denying these events, but they're also scoffing and saying, where is the promise of his coming? It's been a couple thousand years. We're saying Christ is going to return. He hasn't returned yet. We know a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. So, but is this necessary then? Is what I'm seeing here, because it's been a couple thousand years since the resurrection of Jesus. Thousands of years before that was the flood. So it sounds like these plate tectonics and everything going on geologically would take time to come to that culmination, the end game here in the end times. And so would you say then, Ryan, the end couldn't have occurred in 1st or 2nd or 3rd century AD? It had to build up over time to get to where we are today.
Absolutely. And it's still going to take a while, right? It'll get to the point where life is unsustainable and Jesus has to step in and return. But then it'll continue, right, until He actually recreates the earth at some later point.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good point. So those that would say that the end, the second coming, was in 1st century AD and 70 AD, that would be misunderstanding the science, but also Revelation and Isaiah and Ezekiel and other passages you were pointing to as well. Okay, I wanted to ask you, because I thought this was really interesting, and I looked up some pictures of this creature. Your theory that Leviathan was Deinosuchus. Yeah. And what a beast. Thank God those don't live today. Just these massive, terrible crocodiles. And so I wonder, and with Deinosuchus, what a threat that would be, because that kind of creature would dominate the water, but it could also come on land and dominate the land. And so it could terrorize in many ways. And I was reading that it would feed on big dinosaurs, even T-Rex. And so what traits do you think from Deinosuchus and then the description of Leviathan in Job, which traits do you think fit the best where it would be that creature?
Yeah, so it talks about it leaving a shining, shimmering wake behind it. You see that easily when crocodiles are out there swimming at the surface of the water, or I should say crocodilian species, because we can see that in modern crocodiles. When a crocodile walks through a muddy environment, it leaves pointed tracks in the sand, which is another indicator, identifier in Job 41. And I don't know if you can see my screen. I actually pulled it back up the slide where I actually have a
Yeah,
picture of that. Yeah,
I've
there
got
we
it
go.
on screen.
So there's a trackway and this is in sand actually, but you can see that the steps of the claw marks, right? Those could be considered pointed, right? But then also you've got the way that the tail moves under the sand, and those almost look like kind of these on echelon pointed marks in the sand. It talks about the scales being fixed close together so that a javelin can't get through, and these crocodilian species actually have these bony plates called scutes, and there's a picture of one there. You'll find those frequently in the fossil record. They're bone. I mean, these aren't just like fish scales; these are solid bone, very hard. They're huge. They took down T-Rex and other, big dinosaurs back in their day. 10 meters, that's like 30 feet. That's the size of a bus. Okay, these things are massive. And let's see what else. There is the one about, sparks shooting out of its mouth. Well, I've kind of drawn a artist conception in the top left, and I've got that on my slides just to kind of remind us that, the point of Leviathan was to draw us back to the creator. And so everything I'm kind of sharing with you today is to draw us back to the creator, right? So Leviathan does that. The geologic events coming do that. But I drew him this Dinosuchus or Sarcosuchus. They're all, different crocodilian species.
That's right. Yeah.
Drew it with fire coming out of its mouth. We know that, Komodo dragons and other animals can spit acid or fire or sparks. So it's entirely within the realm of possibility. We don't know because all we got is, fossils, bones left. We don't have any soft parts or, they're not walking around today, but it's possible. And then one of the other things is the teeth, all right? The teeth and claws. The size of these teeth and these Dinosuchus were like the size of a banana. And Job talks about the fearsome iron-like teeth of these creatures. So just so many different indicators, just from the way it moves, the way it hunts, to its anatomical descriptions. I think a lot of creation scientists agree that it's some kind of crocodilian, whether it's Dinosuchus or Sarcosuchus or one of the other super crocs. Okay. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I
And
think
God made
that's no, I think that's good. I think this would make a good clip too, because so many people wonder what Leviathan could have been. And I think this is, or this type of creature, like you said, there's a variety of them, but at the end of the day, they're all the same. The same creature with the variation, but these they're massive and they certainly fit the description. And looking at Job chapter 41, canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? And so it does sound like it is a creature, obviously, that man can't take on. So this is a creature man can't take on, but it also has that ability to be in the water, but to also be on land. That's why I used to think that Spinosaurus would be a good candidate, because you see Spinosaurus is in the water and also can be on land, and it's monstrous. And but Deinosuchus makes a lot of sense too. What you said with the nostrils, that is a good point. Today, the bombardier beetle can do some pretty fascinating things. Komodo dragons have that venomous bite. So there are creatures today. It's been a while, so I might be butchering this, but I remember reading or watching someone speak on some of these fossils of these massive creatures in the past, like Deinosuchus and T-Rex and Spinosaurus, where they had some interesting features associated with their nostrils that they couldn't quite figure out what the use was. And perhaps it did have something to do with breathing sparks or smoke, or, I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but it's entirely possible.
Yeah, I haven't heard that in particular, but I mean, where did all the dragon legends come from? I think they came from some basis in reality.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Legends come from something that's real, and then they're embellished over time, of course. Right now, you've got the dragon that can fly and can breathe a crazy amount of fire, but those are embellishments from something that is based in reality. So I think that's an interesting theory right there, Ryan. That definitely caught my attention. And so, okay, here's another question. It's been good so far. Thanks, Dad. Again, thank you for the question. Do you think that this heavens shaking is going to be God physically shaking it, or like a supernova of a star that shakes the universe by us and moves Earth from orbit?
Yeah. I'm when people say God physically shaking something, I don't really think God is a physical being. And when I'm talking about God the Father, right? Not a physical being. I think he's trans-dimensional or non-dimensional, right? He's not limited in any way. And so I don't think of him as a dimensional being. So I don't think of him as actually, picking up the earth and shaking it like some kind of mad tyrant. But a question about a supernova or a star. Yeah, if any of these things happen to move by Earth, right, they could cause the heavens to, quote, shake. And shake is a really terrible word, because you look at, like, there's like, I don't know, 5 or 6 different Hebrew words. I go into this in the book, that are all translated shake at some point or another. Okay. And so let me just give you a list of them. There's Ragaz. He shakes the earth out of his place in Job 9. But the Hebrew word is Ragaz. There is Ra'ash. The earth will move out of her place or leap like a locust. That's Isaiah 13, Job 39. And then you've got... So, okay, and it says shake the heavens in Haggai 2:6. It's also the word Ra'ash there as well. So again, that's more not necessarily shaking the heavens, but the heavens leap, right? In other words, stars are here and suddenly they're here. Well, because the Earth's orbit just moved potentially, right? From one place to another, just like a locust jumping from one place to another. Moat is another word that's translated as shaking oftentimes. Let's see. Then there's aratz. That's another Hebrew word for shaking. So, and ga'ash. So try and look past that word for shaking. It really does not do justice to the Hebrew at all. It's very hodgepodge when it's used, when it's not, and they use something else. But go back to the Hebrew.
Very interesting. I appreciate it. Here's a popular question. What do you think wormwood is? I know people say a meteor or comet or something, but would a comet or meteor be able to cause water to be bitter from its composition?
Yeah. So hopefully I get to cover a lot of these questions a little bit more in detail in my book, but I'm loving the fact that they're coming up now. Okay, so wormwood, right? If you've got a asteroid, right? And evolutionists they're going to freak out. They're going to be like, if an asteroid hits us, it could release a bacteria, because life has evolved elsewhere in the universe. And so these asteroids could be carrying bacteria, which, could cause the water to go bitter, right? But that's an evolutionary perspective. So I don't want you to be thinking about the asteroid itself maybe carrying the bacteria and this whatever causes the water to go bitter. Instead, think about, right, wormwood being an asteroid, and what happens when asteroids hit the crust of the earth is fractured. Okay, when you fracture the earth's crust, suddenly, let's say you've disposed of nuclear waste or other chemical, industrial waste, toxic waste, or bacteria from deep within the earth, right? Those things could get released through those fractures. And so it's entirely possible that wormwood is our own fault, right, for polluting the earth, that we've buried all this stuff, but when that asteroid hits, it releases all of it and destroys, the drinking water as a natural consequence of our activities, not God being hateful.
Yeah, it's interesting. You made some really good points there. In my study on it, And from my understanding, the name Chernobyl is derived from the Ukrainian word for wormwood.
Wow.
And so what's the Chernobyl disaster? Well, it was a reactor at the power plant at Chernobyl, Ukraine, and it poisoned everything. And so it makes sense if wormwood, if there's a connection to biblical prophecy, wormwood could be some massive meteor that crashes, and on the earth you're going to have nuclear power plants. And what happens if those are destroyed? That nuclear waste and poison is going to infect the water supply. It's going to taste bitter, and it's going to cause a lot of havoc. So that's, I think, something interesting. So yeah, I think you made a good point. That doesn't have to be the meteor or the impact itself, but it's the ripple effect of it. And I just find it interesting that that word is derived from Chernobyl. And so just a lot of
that is really interesting, Donnie. Yeah. Because you have like Fukushima, right? Which was a earthquake and a tsunami, right? And when you look at the fact that, you know, what would an asteroid impact cause? It would cause earthquakes. And if it hits anywhere in the sea, it's going to cause tsunamis. So again, another way of creating another Fukushima potentially.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert at, you know, nuclear power plant and waste maintenance, but in these times, if all that's not being maintained and it's being destroyed or released because of a lot of what's going on, that is going to be, it's going to be scary. It's going to infect the water supply. It's going to be bad all around, which is another reason why people need to seek God and repent, just like in the days of Noah.
Yeah, but I want to remind everyone, right, when the plagues of Egypt struck, it wasn't that it was everywhere, right? It's that the blood in the Nile and in all the water pots, that happened to the Egyptians, and that God's people were preserved from that, right? So when all this stuff's going on, God's people, again, are going to be preserved from that. Like there's still going to be fresh water for, you know, God's people to drink.
Yeah, it's a good point. And then I guess that depends on the view you take. Some in the pre-wrath camp would say that Christians are raptured prior to God's wrath, which would be the vial or bowl and trumpet judgments, where the seals represent tribulation, post-tribulation, pre-wrath. We got the pre-tribulation view that would say we're out of here before the seals, trumpets, and bowls. Then there's the strict post-tribulation rapture model, which would say that we're here for trumpets, vials, and seals, but that we're protected, like you said. So I guess that depends on what view you take within the pre-mill futurist position, but those are some good discussions to be had. And trying to see what is the most relevant question.
I saw one back here from Andrew. He says, wait, so we're polluting the earth, but the idea that we're changing the climate is just a far-fetched agenda? He said, the reasoning here is not consistent. Well, and I wanted to address that because, you know, I'm not saying that the Earth's climate isn't changing. The Earth's climate does change, right? And yes, humanity does have an impact on it. But what I'm saying is the degree to which we're talking about Earth's climate changing in the future and in Revelation is beyond anything that humanity does, right? A volcano goes off or two, even today, a volcano goes off and it's way more, you know, carbon dioxide and other things that are spewed in the atmosphere than years worth of pollution from a major city. So I just want to keep things in perspective, right? That, we do impact the earth. And those things could come back to bite us in a big way in the future. But these things that we're talking about in Revelation are, one, they're not happening right now. So I don't want anyone to go out and freak out like, oh my goodness, you know, the sky is falling right now. They're going to be obvious and they're going to happen around the world. Like that's one of the reasons why they're global, right? That's why the Noah's flood was global, is
right.
No one could deny it when it happened. Still can't deny it, really, if you were thinking person, rational human being that looks at the science. And the same thing then in the future, right? You're not going to be able to deny that, oh, wow, this sign is being fulfilled right now. This trumpet or this bowl is getting blown or poured out right now because this is just so big. It could be nothing else, right?
Yeah, and Andrew's trying to drive us into a discussion on that topic, but I don't want to get the video flagged, so we'll leave that where it is. But it's a good point. It's an important point that you made there. And talking about the Genesis flood, that was a large aspect of part one. And we did have several comments come in. We've had a lot of good feedback of part one. Already, I can tell great feedback in part two as well. This topic is just fascinating, especially for us Christians. We can talk about geology, science, but then also make these connections like you have, Ryan, to the book of Revelation and other prophetic books in the Old Testament, like Daniel. I appreciated that. Ezekiel, Isaiah, so on and so forth. And so a couple comments that came in on part one, which does apply to what we're discussing here tonight in terms of catastrophism, the Genesis flood, and how geology points to the creator in both Genesis and also Revelation. There is a geologist who commented, and he's been present for a lot of our live programs. We had some interaction with him last night in our dating methods seminar. And so I appreciate that from the critics. But he asked in the comment section, Ryan, he said, how can coal or oil be produced rapidly? If I remember correctly, we talked about that briefly, which is, I'm assuming, what motivated him to leave this comment. What is the source of heat, of the heat?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the heat is going to be geothermal heat, so I'm not sure what the question is there, honestly. You have, when you bury things deeper and deeper into the earth, the pressure and the heat go up. That's just the way it works. And so when you have a global flood, you have warm, hot water, right? The Bible tells us the fountains of the great deep burst open. So we know water came from under the earth, under the crust. Well, I'm talking to a geologist now. It came from under the part that we walk on, whether it came from 30 kilometers down beneath the crust at the crust mantle boundary. I'm not going to speculate on where exactly it came from, but for the layperson, right, it came from below the part we walk on, where it's warmer and hotter. And so you have all this hot water, and then you're going to kill a bunch of plants and animals, right? And they're going to go into that hot water. They're going to drown, or if they're an animal, they're going to drown in that hot water. If they're a plant, they're going to form rafts of vegetation, floating masses of vegetation in that hot water. And what's going to happen? You're going to have a lot of bacteria and algal blooms that are the result of that. Howard, okay, awesome. So
there he is.
Yeah. So being a petroleum geologist, you know your geochemistry then, and you know that there's two types. You have a type 2, type 1, 2, and 3. That type 1 is a lacustrine oil source. Type 2 is a marine source, and type 3 is a terrestrial source. Type 1 and 2 will generally give you oils when they are buried and cooked, and those generally come from bacteria. Type 3, being terrestrial source, will generally give you gas, and it generally comes from, I believe, algae. So these things, they get buried, cooked at high pressures and temperatures then, and these hydrocarbons from the bacteria and algae get converted over into chains of hydrocarbons, right? And the more they get cooked, the more those chains get broken down. So you have really long chains. Those are your asphaltenes, your really thick tar oils. The more they get cooked, they become your gasolines, your lighter oils, sweeter oils, and then you keep cooking them, and eventually they become natural gases like propane, butane, stuff like that, where the molecules are really, these long chains of hydrocarbons are broken down. Howard, I said algae and bacteria. So
Yeah, bacteria don't directly create most of the oil that we use, but they do play a significant role in the process.
yeah,
And to Howard and Ryan, you could probably speak to this. Scientists have developed a process in the lab to produce crude oil rapidly, and
yeah,
that process mimics the conditions that create fossil fuels naturally, but
right.
in a significantly accelerated time frame. And I find it funny when they say, well, what's this source of heat and energy, when these same critics are always bringing up what's called the heat problem, because the flood would have comprised a lot of heat and energy.
Yeah.
And so I like to point out that the pre-flood world would have acted as the perfect battery to rapidly produce all of this coal, oil, and natural gas. And in many ways, that process could absorb a lot of that. I'm not saying all of the heat, critics, but it could have absorbed at least some of that heat produced during the flood. And
Yeah.
so, Ryan, feel free to speak to that if you'd like to, brother.
Oh, shoot. The whole world of chemistry is absolutely fascinating, and I would have to dig into it to try and find out. But one thing that just popped in my mind is a question. I don't know the answer is, how much of these reactions are actually endothermic, meaning they pull heat in order to break these chains. How much of these reactions actually pull heat out of their surroundings in order to have the energy to break those molecules apart, to break those atoms apart. I don't know if they are endothermic or not, but that could be a potential way of getting rid of that excess heat. Not to mention just the fact that, I mean, rock is a pretty good insulator, right? It can
Right.
absorb a lot of heat. So,
Well, in his question here, Howard, we appreciate it. He says you still can't explain where the heat comes from in your time frame. But again, we have the global Genesis flood. We have this catastrophic event. If you have plates moving quickly and sliding, you're going to have a lot of heat from friction. If you hold to accelerated nuclear decay, which I think we have evidence for with helium and zircon crystals and radio halos and fission tracks, then you have a lot of heat there as well. So is there a problem in our model, Ryan, with generating heat to rapidly produce oil, do you think?
not that I'm aware of. There might be something, as far as, catastrophic plate tectonics that Baumgartner talks about. But Howard, I would just say this, go to my website and contact me there, because it sounds like this is a conversation that is, better geologist to geologist. We can delve into the technical details and the nitty gritty versus, trying to keep it at a high level for the lay people to understand here. So, because I'm not sure I fully understand his question. I think we need to be more specific exactly and use technical language to do that, which no one's going to understand besides us. So,
Yeah, well, and if you have the proper understanding of the pre-flood world, that you would comprise billions of organisms, 90% of it probably would have been green, a lot more plant life. Andrew Cummings got a good question. How did all these rocks cool down so quickly in a few thousand-year timeline? And why are some layers hotter than others? Any thoughts on that, Ryan?
there's a lot of uh, the word is escaping me right now. There's a lot of randomness, a lot of variability in natural systems, right? And so I would expect some layers in some areas to be hotter than others. I mean, you've got Iceland is very hot geologically, right? And other areas are very cold geologically. It just happens to be where the geologic setting that they're in, right? So how do rocks cool down so quickly? A few thousand years timeline. We're talking about in the post flood world. How do things cool down? Well, I personally think that it is possible. I'll throw this out there, that we've already experienced an orbital shift. And I think we have some hints and some clues that happened in the past with the story of Joshua and the moon standing still and the sun standing still and not going down for about a full day. And then also in the story of Hezekiah, when the sundial moved backwards. how do you explain that unless, you've got something that happened in the celestial realm? And so I tend to think that, you had a lot of earthquakes, a lot of volcanic activity going on after the flood as things kind of headed towards equilibrium, but that God in his mercy might have actually taken the earth and moved it a little further away from the sun so that it wouldn't get too hot until the time was right. And that's what the time of Hezekiah was. I think it's very likely that originally we had a 360-day per year calendar with 30 days per month, and that the flood messed that up, and that that actually, I think around the time of Hezekiah is when a lot of civilizations around the world started actually developing a calendar. Right? There's probably no need to have a calendar if your months are always 30 days and your year's 360 days. Easy. Who cares about a calendar, right? You just count the days. Easy. But suddenly you throw that into confusion, and we know that the Babylonian calendar, 365-day year calendar, the Chinese, all these cultures around the world independently began suddenly developing a 365-day year calendar right around that time, actually, which is really, really fascinating. So was it a temporary thing that God just in his mercy moved the earth back? Nope, you're not going to get too hot for now. We're going to preserve life, and then it's just going to put it back at some point.
Do you think with our model, with flood geology, is it a problem cooling rock into granite? Because typically the critical say, doesn't it take a long time for magma to cool into granite? And I see you shaking your head. So it's not a challenge for us, Ryan?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you can cool off things. You just have to have a mass that's big enough to do it. Right. So if I mean, when we're talking about hot water of the flood, clearly that water is not hot enough where it's boiling, right? But magma is way hotter, right? So really, these granitic batholiths all around the world, even though the flood water is hot by our standards, warmer than oceans are today, it would have been far cooler than those granitic batholiths that are being in place. And so there's a lot of mass there that could actually help cool those more rapidly, right? I don't know,
Yeah.
I'm just speculating here. There's lots of different ways I think to answer this, and these are all great avenues for research for people who actually are willing to go look at the data and with an open mind and do a study on it.
Yeah, because from my understanding, Dr. Andrew Snelling, he's a PhD geologist. He demonstrated that granite can cool rapidly. Granites are fissured, which suggests water was involved with their cooling. And the global Genesis flood would have had a lot of water, that's for sure. And it's important, I think, to note, because you're making some important points there, Ryan, in terms of research projects. And in our program last night, for example, in our dating methods seminar, Mike Ord made the important point that we got the big picture. We know there was a worldwide flood. We have the evidence. Now there's a lot of the details that we're still working on, which makes being a creationist fun because it gives us what? It gives us research. How much
Yeah.
fun is in having all the answers? There's not much fun in that.
Exactly. The one thing that I like to really kind of drive home with this whole idea about, future geologic events happening. I personally believe the theory of evolution is going to go extinct, and it's going to go extinct because no one's going to be able to believe it anymore because they're going to see that geologic processes are not slow and gradual, right? So part of the reason for the fact that we need geologic catastrophes as a way of waking us up is right is because we don't believe that geology points to the creator, right? Geology has become its own god, right? And what did the creator do when he was trying to liberate Exodus from Egypt? He went after the gods of Egypt and showed how powerless and weak they actually were, that they were false gods, right? So our God today is this God of materialism and evolutionary thinking, where you're your own highest creature, your own highest moral authority, and you evolve from nothing, and geologic processes are slow and steady. And without those geologic processes being slow and steady, you can't have evolution. So what's God going to do? Well, all right, he's going to tag the idea that geologic processes are slow and steady with a view geologic catastrophes. And no one, I mean, they say, right, there's no atheists on the side of a foxhole, right? Well, you're sitting there, you're watching a volcano going off. This is what was so amazing about Mount St. Helens, is so many people came to creation scientists because of a geologic catastrophe. And so when you have them happening repeatedly in people's backyards, it's going to be a real tough sell for the diehard evolutionists to be going around telling people that geologic catastrophes are slow and steady when, oh my goodness, a huge crack just opened up in my backyard and swallowed my entire olive orchard. Hold up, that actually happened a couple of years ago in Turkey, right? I mean, right? It's like, come on, people.
Yeah, those are some good points. I'm curious as to your thoughts, Ryan. I've heard critics argue that there isn't enough water to flood the earth. What would be a good response? What is the best source of water for us as flood proponents?
I don't know. I don't even know. I just kind of always assumed that there was enough. You take the earth and you flatten it all out, right? I think what they're trying to say is there's not enough water to flood Mount Everest, right? 29,000 some feet above sea level. And they're right. But the problem is that there's marine fossils on Everest, right? At Ordovician, I believe. And so, okay, how did those get there? Well, obviously, Everest was on the bottom of the sea at one point before it was tectonically uplifted.
Right.
So you don't have to have 29,000 feet of water, right? If you put Everest back where it was, flat on the bottom of the ocean, then you can get away with a lot less water if you spread it out. So
it's a good answer. Shepard asked, wouldn't the waters below shot into space dissipate most of the heat?
Maybe.
Well, I've heard Andrew Snelling say that the supersonic steam jets could have taken a lot of that heat into space, and space is a heat sink. But I mean, there's a lot of heat produced from the flood, so I think we're going to need more than just that, but certainly a source of many. So that's a good point.
Yeah.
Ryan, in the comment section of your last video, which anybody just joining us, if maybe this is you started with part 2, please go watch part 1 after this, because they connect really well, Ryan, and it's a 2-part series for a reason. We want people to watch both and get all of this important material, because we had a lot of good discussion in part 1 as well. I got at least one good short I put out, and then also a clip from it as well to promote it. So cool. This question was in the comment section. Someone mentioned the Appalachian Mountains, but the question would be, can flood geology account for the Appalachian Mountains?
I think so. I don't know. I haven't studied the Appalachians. I was raised there, but that was before I got into geology. So they are older and they are very different from the Rockies and the mountains that I was talking about in the last episode. That being said, however, you look at the fold and thrust belt, and it's actually not that different. You still see the same horizontal compression that uplifts the mountains. So whether that happened on day 3 of creation, and then the Appalachian Mountains are very eroded, remnants of pre-flood day 3 tectonically created mountains. I don't know. I tend to think that pretty much the entire geologic column, because it all has fossils in it, is from the flood. But how those play into it, I don't know. What I can tell you is that in the Western US, at least, things that are the same age are most definitely consistent, structural fractures and things that form in rocks of the same age as the Appalachians. Those fractures and faults are definitely consistent with having happened at the tail end of the flood during what we call the laramide orogeny. So I don't know the actual mechanics of that area and how it would fit into a catastrophic plate tectonic model.
If I were to play devil's advocate, Ryan, and I was a critic, I could say, well, the evidence does not suggest one big worldwide flood over a short period of time, because the fossils themselves, the billions of fossils that we find, should be more mixed. It should be more random, where you got maybe humans mixed with dinosaurs, pterosaurs mixed with birds, rabbits in the Cambrian, so on and so forth. And so they'll look to the fossils themselves and the sorting, if there is any, as a way to argue against a single worldwide flood. You personally, Ryan, how do you feel the best way to address that is?
The zonation in the fossil record and the sorting of it.
Yeah, well, I think more so their assertion that the fossils themselves should just be more mixed in general, all throughout if there's a worldwide flood, you think all these creatures would be mixed and you'd find them all together, is their assertion.
You don't actually see that in any geologic catastrophes. I'm thinking Spirit Lake, where the logs that were all blown out by the volcano and floated in Spirit Lake for years as they sank. We're not exactly sure why they sank in the order that they sank, but they sank in groups of different species. Probably because the woods are different densities, have different sap contents. And so, it's entirely possible that, in fact, it's very likely that a global flood is going to actually order a fossil record more than a random evolutionary sequence, right? Yeah, I think you would expect to see much higher randomness to the fossil record if you just had a random creature dying here, dying there, right, and getting buried over time. But what you see is so ordered, and we see that in catastrophes. You see strata forming overnight in geologic, mud flows, and turbidites in the bottom of the ocean that have happened recently. So I don't see it as a problem in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I see it as a problem for the evolutionists, not for creationists.
Well, and if you were to make the wrong assumption that, hey, ecosystems and regions today, that's exactly how the pre-flood world was laid out, you could come up with a false challenge. But in the pre-flood world, you have these different regions that comprise different fauna, different creatures, different animals, and then those are buried and transported, and that's in many ways how you find them. Then I think that's a good point you made, Ryan. And okay, we'll start to wind down here. Ryan, I could talk to you all day, but I can already tell you're a fan favorite, brother, and so we'll have to book a third program at some point in the future. I'm curious as to your thoughts on this, that Andrew says, but the fossil record is clearly not sorted hydrologically, so the Spirit Lake is not a good analogy. What are your thoughts on that pushback, Ryan?
I'm blown away by it, because I don't know of any deposit that's not hydrogeologic. I mean, hydrologic. You talk about even the sediments that are supposedly laid down in aeolian environments, dunes, right? You talk about the Tapete sandstone, for example, and everyone thinks that's just a desert environment that's been preserved. But you look at the footprints of the critters that are walking up those dunes, and they're different from the footprints that are left by modern lizards walking up dunes, and they're much more akin to footprints of critters that are left in underwater dunes, right? And we know that the bottom of the ocean is full of dunes. I want to say in the region of the Bahamas, there's some pretty big underwater dunes. And so I'm not sure that there's actually any geologic sedimentary layers that were
not laid down by water. Even the wind-blown, ashfall deposits probably, went through water. So.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you engaging that, Ryan. And why don't we end with a question on the topic of part 2, geology and revelation points to the creator. We'll wrap up with this. It's been a lot of fun, and I always enjoy the interaction with our live chat. And so thanks. Dad is wondering, do you believe the increased solar activity over the past couple weeks plays a role on the increase of earthquakes and volcanoes that have been occurring all over the world?
Yeah, I think that there would be a connection of some sort. But again, I think it's just, it really is so small, and it really doesn't matter what's going on right now. The solar activity, the number of earthquakes, volcanoes, everyone freaks out. All the theologians are like, this is happening, the earthquakes are increasing, but I'm here to say, let's get real. This is nothing compared to what's coming and what's being talked about. So,
actually, if you don't mind, Ryan, one other comment that came in the comment section of the last program, some people were saying that fossils are being formed today, and they gave a couple examples. One was the Bahamas. And so what do they mean, these critics, by fossils are forming today? And we have several, like, is this a challenge to the flood, a challenge to anything we're saying? What are your thoughts on that overall point, Ryan?
Yeah. What do you mean the Bahamas? You've got, some examples of fossils being formed there?
I saw the comment.
Okay.
And so out of curiosity, I looked it up, and they did say that some fossils are in the beginning stages of forming, but I'm not really sure. I don't have any examples at the top of my head. It was a critic.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I guess we got something here from Howard F. He says fossils are absolutely being formed today in beach rock limestone in the Bahamas and many other places.
Yeah. Okay. They're talking about coquina then. Coquina is just shells being cemented together. Shells are very easy to fossilize because they're already actually a mineral, right? They're calcium carbonate already. So, okay, not coquina. All right.
Well, Howard, if you'd like,
you
can give us an example.
Yeah.
I mean, the level of fossilization that we see in the fossil record, the amount of preservation that we see in some of these dinosaurs and creatures and soft-bodied. He says
grainstone. So limestone, grains in it. Okay, very hard, of course. Yes. And it's got fossils in it. Sure. I mean, you take anything like that and you bury it in mud, and it's going to fossilize. It's very easy to do, like I said, with something that's a shell. Coquina is it's a grade, right? You got a grainstone, which is what Howard's talking about, where you've got kind of fossils that are shells that are free floating in there, and the matrix of the rock is grains that are touching, not the fossils that are touching. A coquina is where it's just like solid, just broken up fossil shells touching, right? So it's almost entirely shells with a little bit of cement in there. So we're talking about the kind of this gradational spectrum here. And yeah, again, okay, give me an example of an actual soft-shelled organism that's being preserved today. And I don't see that happening unless you're in a catastrophic type environment, a mudslide or a small local flood, something like that, right? Concretion, yeah, concretions form all the time, but again, all of those are already mineralized structures, not soft organisms. So there's a difference between what we're talking about right now is different than what we're talking about in the flood.
Yeah, the kinds of conditions, and it's great having you here. You have so much knowledge on this, Ryan. Some of the examples we find in the fossil record from memory, fish being eaten, fish giving birth. Isn't there an example of an ichthyosaur? Maybe, yeah, I mean, there's these examples of these incredibly preserved fossils that could only have, it doesn't take, millions to billions of years to give birth. So this requires rapid burial and rapid preservation. And so, okay. I mean, we could engage the chat all day. So this has been fun. Ryan, I've really enjoyed your time here. I know how busy you are. And so I appreciate this. Hopefully we can do another program in the future, maybe before the summer's over. We'll chat, via email and see what we can do. So this has been good. This has been comprehensive. Both programs have flown by with you, Ryan. I've really enjoyed our discussions, and I've also really enjoyed your talks. Tonight was great. Geology and Revelation points to the Creator. Amen. Ryan, I want to hand it to you, brother. If there's any final words, final thoughts, anything you want to leave myself with, and also the audience.
Man, just, be ready. So start thinking about the Creator and the fact that He's out. He loves you. He's out there to rescue you. Donny, I know you do. You're doing a great work and great ministry to try and, bring an awareness of Him to people who don't have it. And so I'm hoping that everyone out there who's here just to kind of maybe even argue in the chat or, throw challenging things out here, it's appreciated. That's awesome. Keep everyone on their toes. And, but also just, I'm so grateful that they're here listening and hearing, because I think when these things happen, it'll click for some of them. And, and for everyone else, just keep searching, keeping open, because I think these events are going to happen soon. So we'll know one way or the other. It'll be obvious.
Amen. Click like it clicked for so many of us. I know it clicked for me. I got saved at around 27, 28. I was not a young earth creationist. I didn't believe in, separate ancestry or the worldwide flood or anything like that. But it clicked for me, and hopefully it'll click for others as well that are listening. We want to plant seeds. We can win arguments and answer challenges all day, but it's about winning souls, bringing people to the truth, and pulling people out of the fire, like the Bible says. And wow, this was a great presentation. Remnant Rendezvous Ministry website. So you got some good material there, and on your YouTube channel as well. And your book right here that people can check out. A Believing Geoscientist Investigation of Prophesized Catastrophe and Rescue. So very good. I'll make sure all of that is in the description box as well. Ryan, God bless you. Thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate your time and efforts in upholding the truth here of biblical creation and what's to come that we can read about in Revelation. To the audience, thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate the stimulating chat. We don't mind the challenges. We don't mind the interaction. Keeps it more fun. We like the energy, and it makes these programs fly by. They're always a lot of fun and stimulating. So thanks for the comments, the support, the feedback. And for now, Standing for Truth is signing out. God bless all.